Everyone wants to call the dancing plague of 1518 a psychological event, and maybe it was. But consider this. If it was nothing more than stressed minds breaking down, why did the city respond by hiring musicians? Why did they build a stage? Why did they open guild halls and give the afflicted more room to move? Because the people watching it happen did not think they were watching hysteria. They thought they were watching something that had to finish, something that had entered the city and would not leave until it was done. And before this story is over, the most disturbing question is not why they danced. It is why no one could make them stop. 500 years later, we still cannot. This is the dancing plague of 1518. Before we get to the theories, there is one detail buried in the historical record that almost no one talks about. It changes the way this entire story feels. Stay with me. It begins the way all truly terrifying things begin. Quietly. Not with thunder, not with screaming, not with a monster stepping out of the dark. Just a woman in the street. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a prosperous trading city in what is now northeastern France, a woman stepped out of her home and began to dance. Her name, according to the historical record, was Frau Troffea. She was not celebrating. There was no wedding procession, no feast day music, no circle of laughing neighbors clapping along. There was only the city around her, cramped houses leaning over cobblestone lanes, open windows, people working, children watching, the smell of summer heat and old stone hanging in the air. And in the middle of it, Frau Troffea started moving. At first, maybe no one was afraid. That is one of the things that makes this story so unnerving. The first few seconds of a nightmare almost always look ordinary. A shadow seems slightly out of place. A neighbor does something strange enough to notice, but not strange enough to run from. Maybe someone smiled. Maybe someone whispered, "What is she doing?" Maybe her husband called her name from the doorway. But Frau Troffea did not stop. And here is the detail to hold on to. By the time she finally collapsed, the danger was no longer inside one woman. It had already started looking for the next body. She danced through the afternoon, through the sunset, through the sounds of a city settling into the kind of quiet that should have ended things. She was still moving when the market emptied, when shutters closed, when the street should have gone dark and still. Imagine being one of her neighbors trying to sleep that night. No music, no voices, just the scrape of shoes against stone, rhythmic, unending. A human sound where there should not be one. Coming back, going away, coming back again. Her feet blistered. Her body wore through its reserves in public, while the city watched and failed to understand what it was seeing. By morning, she was still there. By the second morning, she was still there. By the third, the people who had started by watching from their windows were no longer sure whether to feel sorry for her or afraid of her. She danced for 4 days before she collapsed. 4 days, not minutes, not hours, days. And when she finally fell, Strasbourg did not exhale in relief, because by then, she was no longer alone. Within a week of Frau Troffea's first steps, 34 people had joined her. Within a month, 400. 400 people dancing in the streets of a single city, not by choice, not in joy, not because music had carried them somewhere warm and forgettable. They moved with the desperate, hollow compulsion of people whose bodies had become separate from their own will. That is the part that matters. They were not performing, they were enduring. Picture the scene widening day by day. One person becomes several. Several become dozens. Dozens become a moving crowd that no one can reason with, bargain with, or physically restrain for long. Doors open and people step into the street, not to watch anymore, but because something in them has begun answering the same command. A woman who had been praying suddenly rises. A man leaving a bakery stops mid-step. A child sees the adults moving and begins to tremble at the legs. A wife grips her husband's sleeve because his foot has started tapping against the stones and he cannot explain why. And then he is in the street. What makes a body betray itself that completely? What turns an ordinary street into a trap? And what would be worse, realizing the dance is spreading, or realizing the people spreading it are fully awake inside it? That they can see what is happening to them and feel it and cannot stop it. The accounts from this event are not campfire rumors. They are not legends that grew teeth over generations. They come from physician reports, city council records, and contemporary chronicles. Multiple witnesses, multiple documents, all describing the same impossible thing. People danced until their feet bled through their shoes, until their joints swelled, until their breathing became ragged, and the body, which is built to protect itself, continued past every alarm it had. At the height of the outbreak, according to one physician's account, the dancing plague was killing approximately 15 people per day. 15 people per day dancing themselves to death. It is easy to let that stay a number. Don't. Think about what the city had to become for that to be true. Think about families dragging loved ones back from the crowd, only to watch them crawl toward it again. Think about hands tied around wrists, doors barred from the outside, someone sobbing quietly in a locked room because their legs keep moving under the blanket even when the rest of them has given up. Then think about the people still outside, the scrape of feet on stone, the labored breathing, the wet sound of damaged souls, the awful absence of music or laughter or any of the things that are supposed to live inside movement. Their faces were not joyful. They were terrified. They did not want to be dancing. They simply could not stop. Now here is where the story stops being disturbing and starts being something stranger. Because when Strasbourg decided to act, what they did next is one of the most unsettling, institutional decisions I have ever read in a historical document, and it made everything worse. Strasbourg was not a village. It had physicians. It had a functioning civic government, guild leaders, religious authorities, and practical men whose job was to keep order when fear started moving through a city like water through stone. So when hundreds of people began dancing toward death, the authorities did what authorities do. They asked the experts, and the experts said, "Let them dance." Not because they were cruel, not because they were indifferent. They believed the dancing was caused by a supernatural heat in the blood, a burning force that could only be expelled by continuing the movement. Stop it too soon, they warned, and the heat would turn inward. The body would destroy itself from the inside. The only way out, they said, was through. So the city hired musicians. They brought in drummers and pipers. They built a wooden stage in the town square. They opened the guild halls, large empty spaces where the afflicted could move without crashing into walls or one another. They even hired professional dancers to accompany the suffering, as if choreography could make a nightmare orderly. The city looked at people dying from dancing and built a stage for the dancing to continue. Hold that image. A stage, musicians, a crowd, and at the center of it, not a festival, but an outbreak. There is something almost unbearable about that decision, not because it was evil, but because it was well-intentioned. The people who made it were trying to help. They looked at every tool available to them and decided that cooperation was the only strategy left. That maybe if you gave the thing what it wanted, it would eventually be satisfied and leave. But it did not leave. The music made things worse. New people joined. The deaths continued. The stage that was meant to contain the outbreak became something closer to an altar, one that nobody had meant to build, in service of something nobody could name. Think about the musicians for a moment. A piper lifting his instrument to his mouth while people stagger in front of him with ruined feet. A drummer keeping time because the council paid him to, while the rhythm seems to pull more bodies from the edges of the crowd. At what point does a man like that realize that the beat he is playing may be helping people die? How long before his hands start shaking? How long before he begins to wonder whether the rhythm is really coming from him, or whether he is only the latest body the song is moving through? It was only when the authorities reversed course entirely, removing the musicians, banning the dancing, sending the afflicted to a mountain shrine to pray, that the outbreak began to quiet. By September of 1518, the dancing had stopped, as suddenly and as inexplicably as it began. And that sudden ending may be the most frightening part of all. Because things that end cleanly usually have causes we can name. This did not. I want to walk you through every theory because there are 3 of them, and each one explains part of what happened and falls apart on another part, and it is in those gaps where the real dread lives. Theory 1. Mass psychogenic illness. Modern historians and psychologists have a name for what happened in Strasbourg: mass psychogenic illness, mass hysteria. The theory goes like this. Strasbourg in 1518 was under unbearable pressure. Famine had struck the region. Disease was widespread. The city was overcrowded with refugees who had nowhere else to go. People were hungry, frightened, and living pressed together with no space, no relief, and no end in sight. Under those conditions, collective despair can become physical. One person breaks first. Others, primed by the same fear, follow the same pattern. The body expresses what the mind has run out of ways to hold. It is a reasonable theory, and that is precisely why it is unsettling. Because a reasonable explanation should make the story feel smaller, filed away, understood. But it doesn't. Because even if the mind started this, the body still had to finish it. Documented cases of mass psychogenic illness produce fainting, nausea, tremors, temporary paralysis, and shared symptoms that move through a group like invisible smoke. They are real. They are documented. They cause genuine suffering. But the dancing plague of 1518 asks us to accept something far more extreme. Hundreds of people sustaining full-body physical movement for days and weeks, past pain, past injury, past collapse, with a death toll that climbed to 15 per day. Mass psychogenic illness may explain the first spark. It does not explain the fire. It does not explain why the symptom was dancing and not fainting, why it spread gradually person by person rather than erupting at once, why it lasted months instead of days, why the afflicted appeared fully conscious and fully trapped at the same time, aware of what was happening, unable to stop it. That last part is worth sitting with. Not gone, not unconscious, not numb, awake, present, watching themselves from somewhere they could not get back from. Theory 2. Ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye grain. Consumed in significant amounts, it causes convulsions, hallucinations, burning sensations in the limbs, and involuntary muscle movement. In a famine year, when fresh grain was scarce and contaminated grain might be the only grain, ergot becomes a tempting explanation. It gives the story a physical cause, a chemical nightmare folded into bread. There is a particular horror in that version of events. The idea that something this catastrophic could enter the city through the most ordinary act in the world, a family sitting down to eat. But the ergot theory has serious problems. Food poisoning strikes groups who share the same supply at roughly the same time. The dancing plague spread gradually. One person, then another, in a pattern that looks far more like contagion than like a contaminated meal. And ergot causes spasms and convulsions. It does not produce the sustained, rhythmic, purposeful movement that witnesses in Strasbourg described specifically as dancing. Human enough to be recognizable, intentional enough for musicians to be hired in response, inhuman enough that no one could look at it directly without flinching. Ergot may explain some of the edges. It does not explain the choreography. Theory 3. The Curse of St. Vitus. The people of Strasbourg believed they knew exactly what it was. They called it the Curse of St. Vitus, a Christian martyr whose name had become historically attached to afflictions of uncontrolled movement. His shrine, medieval belief held, could both cause and cure the very thing Strasbourg feared. To modern ears, that may sound like superstition, a frightened city reaching for religion because medicine had failed. But do not dismiss too quickly what belief can do inside a body. Fear has weight. Guilt has temperature. A community that has breathed the same terror for long enough begins to metabolize it differently. In the muscles, in the gut, in the place where the nervous system and the imagination share a wall. If enough people genuinely believed a curse could commandeer the body, then perhaps the idea itself became a mechanism. Not magic, something more unsettling than magic. The body taking a shape the mind had made available. Or perhaps the people of Strasbourg recognized something that centuries of scientific progress have trained us not to look at directly. Because when the authorities finally stopped treating the dancers as patients and started treating them as cursed, something changed. The afflicted were sent to a mountain shrine dedicated to St. Vitus. They were given red shoes. They were led through ritual, prayed over, removed from the streets where the movement had fed on attention and rhythm and the proximity of other moving bodies. And within weeks, the outbreak stopped. Not over years, not after a medical discovery. Within weeks of the decision to treat it as something sacred and terrible, rather than something clinical and containable. Was it the isolation, the broken rhythm, the power of belief operating on bodies that had been primed by belief from the start? Maybe. But that is the problem with this story. Every answer explains one part and leaves another part standing in the dark, waiting. Stay with me, because I have saved the most psychologically disturbing part of this story for last. Not a theory, not a historical fact, something worse. What this event reveals about the human body and what it is capable of doing to itself when the conditions are right. Here is what I keep returning to when I think about Strasbourg in 1518. This event is real, fully documented, recorded by multiple independent sources with no reason to agree with each other and every reason to try to understand. It happened in public, in a major city, in front of people whose profession was to observe and write things down. And it still cannot be fully explained. Every theory brings a lantern into the cave. None of them reaches the back wall. Mass hysteria explains the fear, but not the extremity of the body's response. Ergot explains hallucination, but not the specific, sustained, recognizable rhythm of dancing. Religious belief explains the cultural shape of the event, but not why the first foot moved. Collective trauma explains the pressure, but not the precise and lethal form that pressure took. We are 5 centuries removed from those streets. We have neuroscience, epidemiology, more accumulated medical knowledge than those Strasbourg physicians could have imagined. And we still cannot give a complete account. That gap is not a footnote. That gap is the story. Before we reach the end, I want you to do something. I want you to put yourself inside Frau Troffea's body for just one moment. Not as a viewer, not as a historian, as her. The first movement begins somewhere below conscious thought. A twitch in the foot. A step that arrives before you decided to take it. At first, there is still time to stop. There must be. You tell yourself there is. But the second step answers the first. Then the third arrives without permission. The neighbors are watching now. Someone says your name. Someone laughs nervously. Someone asks if you are well. And you try to stop. This is the moment where the strangeness becomes terror. Because nothing happens. The body continues. The foot comes down. The hip turns. The arms rise. Not like celebration. Not like joy. Like something passing through you. Like a command traveling through muscle and bone that was not addressed to the part of you that can speak. By sunset, the fear is no longer outside you. It is inside every tendon. By midnight, you understand that sleep is not coming. By morning, the pain has become part of the rhythm. By the second day, the people in the street are no longer watching a woman dance. They are watching a woman disappear behind the movement. And then, somewhere in the crowd, someone feels their own foot shift. That is the nightmare. Not that a city danced, that the dance may have been waiting for bodies frightened enough, or broken enough, or simply open enough to carry it forward. By late summer, Strasbourg must have felt haunted by rhythm, even in the silences. Even when the streets were empty, people would have listened for it. The scrape, the shuffle, the sudden stamp of a foot from an alley where no one should have been moving. Imagine the psychological weight on those who had not yet joined. Every ache in the leg becomes a warning. Every restless night becomes evidence. Every moment the mind drifts, the body is monitored for betrayal. A mother watches her child tapping at the table and tells him to stop. A man wakes from a dream with cramped calves and refuses to leave his bed. A priest hears movement outside the church at 3 a.m. and cannot tell whether it is penance, illness, or something older than either word. Fear does not simply observe an outbreak. Fear participates. And that may be the most psychologically dreadful version of the story. Not that some external force invaded Strasbourg, but that Strasbourg itself became the force. Hunger and grief and religious terror and sleeplessness and public panic and official confusion and music and rhythm and the simple, terrible proximity of other bodies doing it, all of it braiding together until the city generated a signal no single person could refuse. A command with no voice. A command that entered through the eyes, the ears, the nerves, the idea of it. Dance. Dance until it leaves. Dance until you can't. The last person documented to stop was on a road leading away from Strasbourg, walking toward the shrine of St. Vitus, According to the Chronicle, they simply stilled mid-step, as though whatever had been propelling them had quietly let go. No explanation, no transition. One moment moving, the next moment not. They stood in the road for a long time before they continued walking. We started with the question, if the dancing plague of 1518 was only mass hysteria, only a psychological event, a collective breakdown, why did the city of Strasbourg respond by adding music, by building a stage, by making it easier to keep dancing? I don't have an answer. No one does, not completely. What we have is a documented event in a real city, witnessed by real people, that killed hundreds and left behind a question 5 centuries of science, medicine, and scholarship still cannot fully close. Was it mass hysteria? Ergot in the grain? The curse of a saint? Or something that moved through that city in the summer of 1518 that we still don't have the right words for? Tell me what you think in the comments. Every theory is welcome. I read every single one. And if this is the kind of story that stays with you, the kind where the scariest thing isn't a monster, but a historically verified, fully documented event that nobody can explain, then you already know where to find more of them. Because somewhere in the record, Frau Troffea is still in the street. The musicians are still playing, and someone in the crowd is still looking for a way to stop. Sleep well, if you can.